"She's done. Pack her things. Olivia is moving in by Friday." Daniel Whitmore said it at the dinner table, in front of his mother, his brothers, the staff, everyone who had watched Emily give 10 years of her life to that family. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't flinch. He said it the way you cancel a subscription bored certain already thinking about something else. Emily sat completely still. Her hands didn't shake. Her face didn't break. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't say a single word. She simply stood up, set her glass down, and walked out the door. And that silence, that one quiet exit, was the decision that brought Daniel Whitmore to his knees. If this story makes you feel something, subscribe to our channel and follow Emily's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Emily Carter had a habit that Daniel Whitmore never noticed. Every morning before he woke up, before the alarm went off, before the house filled with the noise of another busy Chicago day, Emily would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she never finished, and she would go over the numbers. Not her numbers, his numbers. The quarterly projections, the loan repayment schedules, the investor correspondence that arrived after midnight because the men on the other side of those deals were in different time zones and never thought to consider the hour. She would read every word. She would mark every discrepancy. And by the time Daniel came downstairs in his pressed shirt, already rehearsing whatever speech he was going to give that day, the problems had already been solved by hands he never looked down at long enough to thank. That was Emily's life, not the life people saw from the outside, not the woman in the designer dress standing beside the successful CEO at charity galas, not the woman who smiled perfectly in the photographs that appeared in Chicago Business Monthly 3 times in the last decade. Not the quiet, elegant wife who knew exactly which fork to use and exactly when to laugh at the right joke told by the right investor. The real Emily existed in the margins. She existed in the red pen marks on draft contracts, in the late-night phone calls she made to a nervous bank officer named Gerald Fitch, who had almost pulled their funding in 2017 because Daniel had missed 2 critical deadlines and never told anyone. Emily had called Gerald herself. She had driven to his office with documents she had prepared overnight. She had sat across from him for 3 hours and rebuilt his confidence in Whitmore Industries from the ground up. Gerald Fitch still sent Emily a Christmas card every year. He never sent one to Daniel, but Daniel didn't know that because Emily handled the mail. She handled everything. That was the invisible architecture of their marriage. Daniel provided the vision, the charm, the big ideas that lit up any room he walked into. And Emily quietly, efficiently, loyally built the structure underneath those ideas so they didn't collapse the moment reality tested them. For years, she told herself that was enough. She told herself that being the foundation of something great was its own kind of greatness. She told herself that Daniel knew, that somewhere behind the confidence and the ambition and the way he took credit so naturally that even he probably believed it by now, somewhere in there, he knew what she had given. The Sunday of the dinner was the day she finally stopped telling herself that. The Whitmore estate sat on the north shore of Lake Michigan, 40 minutes outside Chicago, in the kind of quiet, old-money neighborhood where the houses were set far back from the road and the lawns were so perfectly maintained they looked painted. Daniel's mother, Victoria Whitmore, had lived there for 31 years. She had raised her 2 sons in that house after her husband's early death, and she had turned grief into granite, building a personality so hard and so certain of its own importance that even her own children flinched when she disapproved of something. Victoria had never fully approved of Emily, not from the beginning. "She's sweet," Victoria had said to her older son Marcus, 2 weeks after Daniel brought Emily home for the first time. She had said it the way you say something is adequate, the way you describe a hotel room that isn't quite what you expected but will do for the night. Emily had overheard. She had been standing in the hallway outside the sitting room holding a tray of coffee cups she'd offered to carry because it was something to do with her hands, and she had stopped walking the moment she heard her name, and she had stood there long enough to hear the full assessment. "Sweet," Victoria had said, "but not quite what I imagined for Daniel. He needs someone who matches his ambition." Emily had carried the coffee into the room. She had smiled. She had sat down and listened to Victoria talk for 2 hours about the Whitmore family history, and she had asked all the right questions and laughed at all the right moments, and she had never once let a single feeling show on her face. That was 10 years ago. In 10 years, the assessment had never changed. Victoria still looked at Emily the way you look at furniture that doesn't quite fit the room. Present, functional, but not quite right. The Sunday dinners at the estate happened once a month. They were not optional. Victoria framed them as invitations, but everyone in the family understood they were summons. You came. You dressed appropriately. You said the right things. You listened to Victoria's opinions on business, politics, family, and whatever else she had decided deserved her commentary that particular month. And then you drove home, and you didn't complain about it because complaining would get back to her within 48 hours through channels nobody had ever fully mapped. Emily had attended every single one of these dinners for 10 years without missing once. Even the Sunday in February 2021, when she had a fever of 102, and Daniel had said, "It's not a big deal, just take some Advil. My mother's been asking about the quarterly results, and you know how she gets." Emily had taken the Advil, done her makeup, driven to the estate, sat through 3 hours of dinner, and then pulled over twice on the way home because she felt too dizzy to drive safely. She had not told Daniel about the pulling over. He had fallen asleep in the passenger seat. That was their marriage. That was the 10 years Emily had built her entire sense of self around protecting. She found out about Olivia Reed the way most women find out about the things their husbands are hiding, not in one catastrophic revelation, but in a slow accumulation of small details that don't mean anything individually and mean everything together. A name that appeared on Daniel's phone screen when he thought she was in the other room. A restaurant charge on the business account for a place he hadn't mentioned visiting. A shift in the way he talked about certain things, a new vocabulary for certain ideas, a way of describing ambition that sounded borrowed from somewhere else. Emily was good with details. 10 years of managing a company's paperwork without being given a title had made her extraordinarily good with details. And the details told a story that Emily's heart didn't want to read, but her brain couldn't stop processing. She didn't confront Daniel, not right away. She sat with what she knew for 3 weeks. She sat with it the same way she sat with financial problems, quietly, carefully turning it over and looking at it from every angle before deciding on the right response. She thought about what she would lose. She thought about what she already had lost, though she hadn't had the courage to name it yet. She thought about what the right response even meant in a situation where you had spent 10 years making yourself smaller and quieter and more useful, and the person you had made yourself smaller for had looked at that smallness and decided it was all you were. The Saturday night before the family dinner, Emily sat at the kitchen table after Daniel had gone to bed, and she opened her laptop and she spent 4 hours reviewing every document she had ever signed on behalf of Whitmore Industries. There were more than she had consciously remembered. The bank guarantees, the investor agreements, the vendor contracts, the letters of financial assurance that Gerald Fitch had required before releasing the second tranche of funding in 2018. Her name was on more of the company's critical infrastructure than she had fully articulated to herself. Not because she had planned it that way, because she had been there and capable and willing, and Daniel had been relieved every time she stepped in, and over 10 years, relief and convenience had quietly built something that neither of them had ever sat down to discuss. She closed the laptop at 2 in the morning. She sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, and then she went to bed and she lay beside her sleeping husband, and she stared at the ceiling and she made a decision, not about what she would say, about what she wouldn't. The Sunday dinner started normally enough. Marcus was already there when Emily and Daniel arrived, standing in the driveway with his wife Renata, who was 3 months pregnant and tired, in the way that made her quieter than usual, but no less observant. Marcus and Emily had always gotten along. He was the more thoughtful of the two Whitmore brothers, the one who noticed things and asked follow-up questions, and remembered what you'd told him the last time you'd spoken. He looked at Emily when they got out of the car, just a look. But Emily saw in it that he already knew something was wrong. Maybe not the specifics, but the atmosphere, the way Daniel had been acting, the way certain conversations had been redirected. Marcus had noticed, and he was watching. "You look tired," Renata said to Emily, pulling her into a hug. "I'm fine," Emily said. "You always say that." "Because it's always true." Renata held the hug a beat longer than usual and didn't argue, which meant she didn't believe it either. Victoria was holding court in the sitting room as she always was, dressed in the kind of casually elegant clothes that communicated wealth without appearing to try, which was itself a form of effort so intensive it required years of practice. She kissed Emily's cheek in the European fashion she had adopted at some point in her 50s, both cheeks a gesture that managed to feel simultaneously warm and completely impersonal. "Emily," she said. "Daniel." "You look wonderful, Mother," Daniel said. "I always do," Victoria said, which was her version of thank you. They moved into the dining room. The table was set for 8, which was 2 more than their usual number, and Emily noticed but didn't say anything. She assumed it was one of Victoria's friends, perhaps the Caldwell woman who appeared occasionally, or the retired judge, whose name Emily could never remember because he never spoke to her directly. The first hour passed the way these dinners always passed. Marcus and Daniel talked business with their mother, who had opinions about everything, and the confidence of someone who had never once doubted that her opinions were correct. Renata and Emily talked quietly at their end of the table about the things they actually cared about Renata's pregnancy, the neighborhood they were thinking of moving to, a book Renata was reading that Emily had read 2 years ago and still thought about sometimes. It was ordinary. It was the kind of ordinary that Emily had spent 10 years building and maintaining and protecting, and sitting inside it on that Sunday, knowing what she knew. She felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time. Grief. Not anger, not yet. Just grief for the ordinary she had worked so hard to hold together. The front door opened at 6:47. Emily knew the exact time because she had looked at the clock on the mantel 30 seconds earlier, a reflexive thing she did in stressful situations, the way other people count their breathing. She heard voices in the entryway. Daniel's voice, a woman's voice, warm and practiced, and carrying with it the particular kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly how you're going to be received. And then they walked in. Daniel had his hand at the small of her back. I was guiding her into the room, the way you guide someone through a door you've been looking forward to, opening, and the expression on his face was one that Emily had once known very well, the expression he wore when he was proud of something, when he wanted people to see what he had, when he was performing for an audience he valued. He had worn that expression at their wedding. He was wearing it now with someone else. Olivia Reed was exactly what Emily had imagined from the details, and exactly what she hadn't, because no amount of imagining fully prepares you for the physical reality of the woman your husband has chosen to replace you with. She was 31 or 32, Emily guessed, with the kind of carefully composed beauty that required significant effort to make look effortless. Dark hair. A dress that managed to be both conservative enough for a family dinner and obviously expensive enough to communicate status. A smile that didn't waver when she entered a room of strangers who were all staring at her. She was not uncomfortable. That was the thing that landed hardest. She had known she was coming here. She had dressed for it, prepared for it. She was not the surprise party in this room. Daniel's eyes found Emily's immediately. Not the way you look at someone when you're guilty. The way you look at someone when you're daring them to react. When you've already decided what you're going to do, and you want to see what they're going to do about it. And some part of you, the part that has grown too large and too certain of itself over too many years of being told, yes, believes that whatever they do, you will be able to manage it. "This is Olivia," Daniel said. He said it to the room. He didn't say it to Emily specifically, but the sentence was for Emily. Every word of it was arranged for Emily. "She understands my world," he said. "She belongs beside me." The room went silent in the specific way. Rooms go silent when something happens that is too large and too wrong for anyone to know how to immediately respond to. Victoria's expression did not change, which meant she already knew. Marcus's jaw tightened and he looked at Emily and then looked away, which meant he had not known and was feeling something he didn't have words for yet. Renata made a small sound, not quite a word, and then pressed her lips together. The 2 other guests, the Caldwells Emily now registered, both of them stared at their plates. Everyone looked at Emily. It was almost choreographed the way everyone looked at her, because everyone understood that this was the moment. This was the inflection point. This was where Emily Carter was going to scream or cry or throw something or demand an explanation or beg or all of those things at once in some magnificent and horrifying collision of 10 years of marriage detonating at a family dinner table. Emily looked at Daniel for a long moment. She looked at the hand he still had on Olivia's back, the pride still visible in his posture, the dare still sitting in his eyes. She looked at his mother, who was watching the scene with the careful attention of someone who had already decided which side she was on. She looked at Renata, who had her hand over her mouth and tears forming at the edges of her eyes, feeling the pain on Emily's behalf, with an openness that Emily herself could not afford right now. She looked at Marcus, who was looking back at her with an expression she would think about for a long time afterward, helpless and sorry and ashamed, in a way that had nothing to do with anything he had personally done. Then Emily reached out and placed her wineglass on the table. Not hard, not with drama. She set it down the way you set something down when you're done with it. She stood up, she smoothed her dress, she picked up her purse from the back of her chair, and she walked out. Not fast, not slow. She walked the way she always walked, with the quiet, deliberate composure that people had always mistaken for reserve, and was actually, if they had ever looked closely enough, a form of extraordinary control. She did not say a word, not one single word. She walked through the dining room, through the entryway, out the front door, down the steps to her car. She sat in the driver's seat. She put the key in the ignition. She drove. Behind her, in the dining room of the Whitmore estate, Daniel stood with his hand on another woman's back and watched his wife leave, and he smiled. He actually smiled, because he thought he had won. He thought this was the end of something, the clean conclusion to a situation he had already decided on, accomplished now without the messiness of arguments and confrontation. He had expected tears, and instead he'd gotten silence, and he read the silence as defeat. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea that the silence wasn't defeat, that it wasn't shock, that it wasn't helplessness. The silence was a woman who had spent 3 weeks reviewing every document she had ever signed on behalf of a company her husband believed was entirely his own. The silence was a woman who had spent the previous night sitting at a kitchen table in the dark, going over what she was going to do and what she was going to need, and who she was going to call on Monday morning. The silence was a woman who already knew exactly what happened next. Daniel didn't know it yet. He stood in his mother's dining room with his hand on Olivia Reed's back and his father's watch on his wrist, and the name Whitmore attached to an empire he had built in his own mind, and he smiled, and he had no idea that the most powerful thing in that room had just walked out the front door. The drive back to Chicago took 40 minutes. Emily drove the entire way without crying. She had learned over 10 years to separate the feeling from the function. You felt the thing. You acknowledged it, and then you set it aside and you dealt with what needed to be dealt with, because falling apart in the car on a Sunday night when you had decisions to make was a luxury you hadn't been able to afford since you were 26 years old, and decided that loving Daniel Whitmore meant carrying more than your share. She got back to the house that had her name on the deed, something Daniel had agreed to in 2015 when they'd refinanced, and which she doubted he remembered with any specificity. She walked inside. She went to her home office, the small room off the hallway that Daniel had never fully acknowledged as hers, that she'd had to claim quietly over years by filling it with files and books and the kind of organized evidence of serious ongoing work that eventually made it too inconvenient to dispute. She sat at her desk. She opened her laptop. She called a number she had looked up the previous Thursday and memorized, rather than saving it in her phone, because she had not wanted to explain the contact if Daniel happened to see it. The phone rang 3 times. "Catherine Brennan's office," said the voice on the other end. "This is Emily Carter," Emily said. "I'd like to schedule an appointment with Ms. Brennan as soon as possible. I was referred by Thomas Aldridge." Thomas Aldridge was the attorney who had helped them purchase the house in 2015, and he had given Emily Catherine's name 6 days ago when Emily had called him with questions about her legal position, and he had heard everything in the questions that Emily hadn't directly said, and had given her the name of the best divorce and financial attorney in Chicago. "Ms. Carter," said the assistant, "Ms. Brennan had a cancellation tomorrow morning at 9. Would that work?" "Yes," Emily said. She hung up the phone. She sat at her desk for a moment. Then she opened the bottom drawer, the one that locked the one Daniel had never asked about, and she took out the folder she had put together over the previous 3 weeks. Documents, contracts, financial records, everything she had quietly, methodically assembled while Daniel was busy not noticing her. She placed it on the desk. She looked at it. She thought about the dinner table she had just left, about Daniel's hand on another woman's back, about the smile he had given her, about the way he had said, "She belongs beside me," as if that settled something, as if belonging were a competition he had judged and declared a winner. She had spent 10 years building something real, and Daniel had spent those same 10 years building a story about himself that didn't include her. It was time for the real thing to speak. Emily Carter opened the folder, took out her pen, and got back to work. In the dining room of the Whitmore estate, Olivia Reed was learning what silverware to use. She had grown up in a family that didn't own a set. She was smart enough and fast enough to watch Victoria and copy her without being obvious about it. She was adapting the way she had always adapted the way that had gotten her here to this table beside this man. She had met Daniel 8 months ago at an industry conference in Miami. He had been standing at the bar looking like someone who was accustomed to being the most important person in a room and slightly irritated when that wasn't immediately acknowledged. She had introduced herself. She had been interested in what he was building. He had been interested in the way she was interested, not the cautious, practical interest of someone who was already thinking about problems, but the bright, uncomplicated admiration of someone who found everything he said impressive. He had loved it. He had called it understanding. What he meant was that she had never disagreed with him. Olivia was not unaware of this distinction. She was 29 years younger than his ambition, and old enough to understand the difference between a man who wants a partner and a man who wants an audience. She had made her calculation. The life Daniel offered was real. The resources were real. The status was real. She had not fully calculated what the cost would be. What would be required of her? The things she didn't know how to do, that the woman who just walked out the door apparently knew how to do quite well. Sitting at the table watching the Whitmores rearrange themselves around Emily's absence with the practiced ease of people who had done versions of this their entire lives, accommodating, adjusting, moving on, Olivia felt something she hadn't expected. She felt the shape of a thing she had stepped into without understanding its dimensions. Victoria was talking. She was saying something about the company's next quarter, about plans she had heard Daniel mention, about the direction she thought things should go. And Daniel was nodding and agreeing and performing the version of himself that he performed at this table. And Olivia was smiling and watching and thinking about the woman who had placed her wine glass down without breaking it, about the way she had walked out without her voice rising even a degree, about how not one person in that room had looked at the door after she left with relief. They had all looked with something else, something Olivia didn't quite have a name for yet. She would understand it in time. But for now, she smiled at Victoria Whitmore across the table and asked about the family history of the estate because she knew an audience question when she needed one, and the dinner moved on, and nobody at the table said Emily Carter's name again. Outside the lake was very dark and very still, and 40 minutes south in a house whose deed had Emily Carter's name on it. A woman sat at her desk in a locked room and built the first draft of her next chapter with the same quiet, deliberate competence she had applied to everything else for the past 10 years. The difference was that this time she wasn't building it for someone else. She was building it for herself, and she had all night. The morning after the dinner, Daniel woke up at 7:15 and reached for his phone before he reached for anything else. No messages from Emily. He set the phone down. He stared at the ceiling. He told himself that was fine. That was expected. She needed time to process. She would reach out by noon probably, or by evening at the latest. She would call or text or show up at the office wanting to talk, and he would be calm and reasonable and explain that this was the best decision for everyone, and she would cry a little, and they would work out the practical details, and that would be the end of it. He had already decided how the story went. He got up, showered, dressed, and drove to the office. He did not call her. He told himself he was giving her space. He was not giving her space. He was waiting for her to come to him. There was a difference, and some part of him understood it, but he was very good at not examining the parts of himself he didn't like. The Whitmore Industries offices occupied 4 floors of a glass building in the West Loop, the kind of building that announced its own importance without trying too hard, which was exactly what Daniel had wanted when he signed the lease 7 years ago. The lobby had the company name in brushed steel letters above the reception desk, and every time Daniel walked through that door, he felt the particular satisfaction of a man who believed he had built something from nothing. He rode the elevator to the top floor. His assistant, a sharp young woman named Priya, who had been with the company for 3 years and had learned very quickly that her job required equal parts scheduling and emotional navigation, was already at her desk. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," she said. Then before he could respond, her expression shifted in a way that made him slow down. "Mr. Fitch from the bank called. He said it was urgent." Daniel frowned. "Gerald Fitch." He called twice. He asked specifically that you call him before 9. Daniel checked his watch. 8:42. He went to his office, closed the door, and called Gerald Fitch. Gerald picked up on the first ring, which was itself unusual. Gerald Fitch was a man of deliberate pacing. He did not pick up on first rings. "Daniel," he said. "Gerald, Priya said you called. What's going on?" There was a pause. Not a thinking pause. A deciding pause. The kind where someone has already decided what they're going to say and is just choosing the exact moment to say it. "I heard some news this weekend," Gerald said. "Personal news, about you and Emily." Daniel felt the first hint of something cold at the base of his spine. He ignored it. "That's a private matter, Gerald. It doesn't affect our business relationship." "Daniel," Gerald's voice was careful and very even. "Emily personally co-signed the guarantee on the Riverside expansion loan. Do you understand what I'm saying? She's my wife. Of course she co-signed." "She was your wife," Gerald said, "and her signature is not a formality. It is a legal instrument that this bank relied upon when extending your company a $32 million credit facility. If her relationship to this company changes in any material way, we have a contractual right to review the terms." The cold feeling spread. "Gerald, you're overreacting." "I'm making a phone call before 9 in the morning on a Monday," Gerald said. "I don't do that for things I'm overreacting to." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying," Gerald said slowly and clearly, the way a doctor explains something serious to a patient who doesn't want to hear it, "that you should talk to Emily, soon, and then you should call me back." The line went quiet. Daniel sat at his desk for 30 seconds without moving. Then he picked up his phone and called Emily. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He called again. 4 rings. Voicemail. He put the phone face down on the desk and looked out the window at the city, and the cold feeling at the base of his spine was no longer ignorable. It had moved upward. It had settled somewhere around his chest. It felt uncomfortably like the beginning of fear. He told himself he was catastrophizing. He told himself Emily would pick up the next time he called. He called 3 more times before noon. She did not pick up. Across town, at exactly 9 o'clock, Emily walked into the offices of Brennan and Associates on Michigan Avenue. Catherine Brennan was 54 years old, had practiced family law and financial litigation for 28 years, and had a reputation that operated on 2 parallel tracks simultaneously. In courtrooms, opposing attorneys described her as methodical, thorough, and deeply uncomfortable to have on the other side of a case. Her clients described her as the person they called when they finally stopped being afraid. Thomas Aldridge had told Emily both things. Emily had decided both things sounded exactly right. Catherine met her in the conference room, not the waiting area. That was the first signal that she had taken this appointment seriously. She was a small woman with silver hair, she wore short and practical, and she had a stillness about her that Emily recognized immediately because she had cultivated the same quality in herself over years of necessary self-control. "Emily Carter," Catherine said, extending her hand. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice," Emily said. "Tom Aldridge called me Thursday," Catherine said. "Sit down." They sat across from each other at the conference table, and Emily placed the folder she had been building for 3 weeks on the table between them, and Catherine opened it, and she read in silence for 6 minutes, while Emily waited without fidgeting. Catherine turned the last page. She looked up. "How long have you been putting this together?" she asked. 3 weeks. "Before or after you confirmed the situation?" "While I was confirming it." Catherine studied her for a moment. "Most people in your position either fall apart or come in with nothing and expect me to build a case from scratch. You've come in with a fully documented picture of your financial entanglement with this company." "I spent 10 years building that picture," Emily said. "I just never expected to need it for this purpose." Catherine almost smiled. It was a controlled, professional, almost smile. "Tell me what you want." "I want to be legally separated from a financial structure that has my name on it without my labor being recognized," Emily said. "I want to dissolve my personal guarantees in a way that protects me without destroying the company, because there are people who work there who did nothing wrong, and I want to know exactly what I'm entitled to." "You're entitled to considerably more than you probably realize," Catherine said. "I'm beginning to understand that." Catherine leaned back slightly. "Daniel Whitmore doesn't know you're here." "No. He'll figure it out when the bank calls him." "The bank already called him this morning," Emily said. Gerald Fitch. Catherine raised an eyebrow. You know Gerald Fitch? Gerald has sent me a Christmas card every year for 8 years, Emily said. I called him Friday afternoon. This time Catherine did smile, fully. All right, she said. Let's get to work. The work took 4 hours. 4 hours of going through documents, line by line, of Catherine asking precise questions and Emily answering them precisely, of 2 women at a table building a legal and financial structure with the kind of focused competence that doesn't leave room for anything except the task at hand. When they finally sat back, Catherine organized her notes and looked at Emily steadily. You have significantly more leverage than Daniel knows, she said. Your personal guarantees are not optional footnotes. They are foundational to his credit arrangements. Any serious restructuring of your relationship to the company, or to him, triggers review clauses. He probably never read carefully because you were always the one reading carefully. Emily nodded. The house, Catherine continued, your name is on the deed. Since 2015, and the consulting work you've done, the contracts, the investor correspondence, the financial restructuring in 2017, none of this was ever formally compensated. No. That's going to be relevant, Catherine said. Very relevant. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I don't want to destroy the company. I want to be clear about that. I understand. There are 47 employees. Most of them have families. That's admirable, Catherine said. And strategically, it's also useful because it means we approach this as a restructuring rather than an attack, which gives us more flexibility and considerably more goodwill with the bank. That's what I thought, Emily said. Catherine looked at her for a moment. Emily, can I ask you something that's not strictly legal? Yes. Did you know when you walked out of that dinner last night exactly where you stood legally? Emily met her eyes. I had a general picture. And the silence, not saying anything, not reacting, that was deliberate. It wasn't quite a question. I learned a long time ago, Emily said, that the person who speaks first in a crisis usually reveals more than they intended to. Catherine held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she picked up her pen. Let's talk about timeline. While Emily and Catherine were building the architecture of what came next, Daniel was dismantling his own afternoon, trying to reach people who suddenly seemed very difficult to reach. He had called Marcus at 11. Marcus had picked up, which was something, but the conversation had been short and strange. Marcus had said he was in meetings. He had said it in the voice of someone who was not in meetings and was using meetings as a reason not to have a different conversation. Marcus, Daniel had said, have you talked to Emily? A pause. No. If she calls you, hi, Daniel. Marcus's voice was level and careful. I'm not going to be a messenger. I'm not asking you to be a messenger. I'm asking. I know what you're asking, Marcus said. And I'm telling you for your own sake that you should figure out how to reach Emily yourself. Because whatever you think happened last night, I don't think it's what actually happened. What is that supposed to mean? It means, Marcus said, and here his voice dropped, became something quieter and more serious than Daniel was used to hearing from him, that Emily has been holding things together in ways you've never fully seen, and that you should think very carefully before you assume that her leaving is the simple ending you think it is. Daniel had wanted to argue. Instead, he'd said fine, and hung up and felt the unsettled quality of a man who doesn't want to examine a thing too closely, because some part of him suspects the examination will be uncomfortable. At 2 in the afternoon, his financial director, a meticulous man named Howard Park, who wore the same brand of suit every day in different colors and had never once in 4 years of working with Daniel been visibly shaken, appeared at Daniel's office door. Howard was visibly shaken. Do you have a minute? Howard said. Sit down, Daniel said. Howard sat. He placed a folder on the desk. Daniel looked at it and felt the cold in his chest again. The Riverside expansion, Howard said. The credit facility is under review. Gerald called me this morning, I know. Daniel. Howard opened the folder. I've been going through the documentation on our major credit instruments. All of them. The Riverside facility, the West Loop refinancing from 2019, the revolving credit line we renewed in January. He paused. Emily's signature is on all of them, not as a co-borrower in name only, as the primary guarantor on the financial representations. The bank's internal assessments reference her specifically. Not you, her. Daniel stared at the folder. How is that possible, he said. It's my company. She was there, Howard said quietly. "Every time we needed someone to stand behind the numbers, she was there. Daniel, I assumed you knew. I assumed it was intentional." "Of course I knew she signed some things," Daniel said, and the defensiveness in his voice was the specific defensiveness of a man who is realizing he did not know nearly as much as he believed he knew. "It's not some things," Howard said. He turned to a specific page in the folder. "The Riverside facility alone is $32 million. The West Loop refinancing is $19 million. The revolving credit line has a $12 million maximum draw. She is the named guarantor on over $60 million in credit instruments, Daniel. And the bank's internal review notes, I pulled them. I have a contact, their notes say, and I'm going to read this exactly. Creditworthiness significantly dependent on Carter's personal financial standing and demonstrated operational involvement." The room was quiet. "Carter," Daniel said. "Not Whitmore. Carter, her name. The name she had kept professionally from the beginning, the habit he had always found slightly irritating and never examined carefully enough to understand. "She's not just attached to this company," Howard said. "She's load-bearing." Daniel stood up from his desk. He walked to the window. He looked at the city he had spent 15 years building a reputation in the city where the name Whitmore on a building meant something, and he understood for the first time that the thing the name was resting on was not what he had believed it was resting on. "Call her," Howard said. "Whatever is happening personally, call her." "She's not picking up," Daniel said. Howard was quiet for a moment. "Then figure out how to fix that," he said. "Because I've looked at the numbers, and without her formal cooperation, we cannot move forward with Riverside. We will almost certainly trigger a review on the West Loop facility, and the revolving line will be frozen pending reassessment. We are looking at potentially $50 million in credit exposure becoming immediately complicated." Daniel turned from the window. "She wouldn't do that. She wouldn't tank the company out of spite." "I don't think it's spite," Howard said carefully. "I think it's leverage. Whether she's using it or it just exists right now, it exists." Daniel sat back down at his desk. He picked up his phone. He stared at Emily's contact information. He thought about Sunday night, about the smile he had allowed himself to feel when she walked out without saying anything, about the way he had read her silence as surrender. He called her again. 4 rings, voicemail. He put the phone on his desk. He pressed his fingers against his forehead. He sat there for a long moment in the office he had named after himself, in the company he had told himself he had built, and something very large and very uncomfortable began assembling itself in the space where his certainty had been. Meanwhile, in an apartment on the north side of the city, Renata Whitmore was on the phone with Emily. She had called at 1 in the afternoon, not sure if Emily would pick up, and Emily had picked up on the second ring. "Are you okay?" Renata said immediately. No preamble. "I'm okay," Emily said. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know he was going to do that. Marcus didn't know either. He was Emily. I want you to know that he was furious." "I know Marcus didn't know," Emily said. "It's all right, Renata." "It is not all right," Renata said, and her voice cracked slightly and she pressed on anyway. "What he did was cruel, walking in like that, announcing it like you were some kind of obstacle he was moving around. You have given 10 years to that man and he treated you like—" "Renata," Emily said quietly. "Sorry," Renata said. "Sorry, I'm angry on your behalf and I have nowhere to put it." "Put it somewhere useful," Emily said. "How are you feeling the pregnancy?" Renata laughed a slightly wet laugh. "You are in the middle of the worst thing that's ever happened to you and you're asking about my pregnancy." "The worst thing that's ever happened to me has been happening for a while," Emily said. "I'm just dealing with it more directly now. How are you feeling?" "Tired," Renata said. "Swollen. Furious at your husband on your behalf. The usual." "Renata," Emily's voice was warm and careful at the same time, "I need you to do something for me. Anything. Don't let Marcus interfere. Not yet. I know he wants to. I know he's angry. Tell him to wait." Renata was quiet for a moment. "Emily, you have a plan." "I have several," Emily said. "Should I be worried about Daniel?" "Not in the way you mean," Emily said. "The company will be fine. The employees will be fine. I'm going to make sure of that. Daniel just needs to understand something he should have understood a long time ago." "What's that?" Emily was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, that there's a difference between someone who stands beside you and someone who holds everything up. Renata pressed her lips together. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay, I'll tell Marcus to wait." "Thank you," Emily said. "Take care of yourself, and that baby." After she hung up, Emily sat in Catherine Brennan's borrowed conference room. Catherine had offered it for the afternoon, and she looked at her legal pad covered in notes, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Clarity. Not the forced functional clarity she had manufactured for years to get through days that asked too much of her. Real clarity. The kind that comes when you stop pretending and start seeing. She had spent 10 years believing that love meant making yourself smaller, that support meant staying invisible, that loyalty meant accepting quietly and endlessly less than you deserved. She had built a company with her own labor and let it carry someone else's name. She had saved it twice, once in 2017 with Gerald Fitch, once in 2020 when a vendor dispute had nearly triggered a cascade of contract penalties that would have cost them the West Loop project. And she had done it so quietly and so competently that it had never required a headline. She had been so good at being invisible that even she had sometimes forgotten she was there. But the documents on the table in front of her did not forget. The bank records did not forget. The signed guarantees did not forget. The Christmas cards from Gerald Fitch did not forget. And Emily Carter, sitting in a conference room on a Monday afternoon with her legal pad and her coffee and her absolute stillness, was not going to forget either. Not anymore. At 4:30, Daniel got a call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't pick up. He had a policy about unknown numbers during business hours, but some instinct sharpened by a day of accumulating anxiety made him answer. "Mr. Whitmore," said the voice, male, professional, deliberate. "My name is Robert Cho. I'm a partner at Brennan & Associates. I'm calling as a courtesy to inform you that we have been retained by Emily Carter in connection with the review of her financial obligations to Whitmore Industries and related personal matters." Daniel's hand tightened on the phone. "She's already talked to a lawyer." "Ms. Carter has retained counsel, yes," Robert said. "We'll be in contact with your attorney. If you'll have Priya send his contact information to our office, we'll reach out directly. In the meantime, I want to be transparent that Ms. Carter's position is that she intends to approach this cooperatively and in the best interests of the company's employees and ongoing operations." "Cooperatively," Daniel repeated. "She is not seeking to destabilize the company," Robert said. "She is seeking to restructure her formal relationship to it in a way that accurately reflects both her contributions and her exposure." Daniel sat very still. "And if I don't agree to cooperate?" There was a brief pause, not hesitant, carefully measured. "Mr. Whitmore," Robert said, "you have approximately $63 million in credit instruments that are at this moment in a state of technical uncertainty because of your personal situation. I would encourage you to think carefully about the framing of that question." The line stayed open for a moment. "Have your attorney call us," Robert said. "Soon would be better than later." He hung up. Daniel sat in his office at 5 in the afternoon, the city going golden outside his window, and he thought about Saturday night, about Emily sitting at the kitchen table when he'd gone to bed. He had assumed she was up late the way she was always up late. He had not asked what she was doing. He thought about the Sunday dinner, about the smile he had felt entitled to. He thought about the word Olivia had used when she described what drew her to him. "Powerful," she had said. "You're the most powerful man in any room you walk into." He had liked that very much. He sat in his office and he thought about what powerful actually meant, and he thought about a woman who had said nothing when he replaced her, and he thought about $63 million in credit instruments, and he thought about Gerald Fitch sending a Christmas card to an address in Chicago every year for 8 years, to Emily's name, not his, hers. He reached for his phone. He called Emily's number. 4 rings. Voicemail. He opened his mouth to speak, and then he stopped because he realized he didn't know what to say. He had spent all day constructing versions of a conversation in which Emily came back to him, in which she accepted some kind of explanation, in which the thing he had done was manageable and reparable on his terms, and none of those versions felt real anymore. What was real was the folder Howard had left on his desk. What was real was Robert Cho's measured professional voice saying, "Technical uncertainty." What was real was that Emily had walked out of his mother's house 40 hours ago without saying a single word. And in those 40 hours she had already retained a lawyer, communicated with the bank, and begun a legal process that he was only now barely beginning to understand. He had read her silence as weakness. He had been catastrophically wrong. I thought about what Marcus had said that morning, that whatever you think happened last night, I don't think it's what actually happened. He thought about Emily's face at that table, not the way he had told himself to remember it as someone defeated someone he had moved past, but the way it had actually looked, composed, still, not broken, decided. He had seen that expression before he realized. He had seen it in 2017 when she had driven to Gerald Fitch's office and turned around a funding crisis in a single afternoon. He had seen it in 2020 when she had sat across from the vendor's lawyer and negotiated a settlement that saved the West Loop deal. He had seen it every time something was genuinely seriously wrong, and Emily had looked at it and gotten very quiet and very still and then fixed it. He had spent 10 years watching that expression and reading it as calmness. He was only now understanding that it was not calmness. It was preparation. He set his phone down on his desk. He sat very still in his office, this office he had named after himself in this company. He had believed was his alone, and he sat with the understanding that was slowly, thoroughly arriving. The woman he had replaced was not the woman he had thought she was. She had never been. And the silence she had carried out of that dining room on Sunday night was not the sound of someone who had lost. It was the sound of someone who had already begun. By Tuesday morning, Daniel Whitmore had not slept. Not really. He had gone through the motions of sleep. Horizontal eyes closed the house quiet around him, but his mind had run continuously through the same loop since Monday evening, the same set of facts assembling and reassembling themselves into a picture he kept trying to find a different interpretation for, and couldn't. $63 million. Emily's name on documents he had signed without reading because she had always been the one who read things carefully. Gerald Fitch, the Christmas cards, the contact he had never known existed because he had never thought to ask who was actually maintaining the relationships that kept his company alive. He got up at 5:45 and made coffee he didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table in the house that had Emily's name on the deed, and he looked at his phone and he thought about calling her again. He had called 11 times since Monday afternoon. 11 times. 4 rings. Voicemail. He had left 2 messages. The first one had been businesslike, which was the wrong tone, and he had known it was the wrong tone the moment he hung up, but had told himself it was appropriate given the circumstances. The second one had been less businesslike, and he had said, "Emily, please," which were words he had not said to another person in years, and the sound of his own voice saying them had been uncomfortable in a way he hadn't expected. She had not called back. At 6:15, his phone rang, and he grabbed it, and the name on the screen was not Emily's. It was his mother's. He almost didn't answer. Then he answered. "Daniel," Victoria said. She did not say good morning. Victoria Whitmore did not preface things. "Mother." "I've been thinking about Sunday," she said. "Mother, it's 6 in the morning." "I've been awake since 4, she said, which was her way of indicating that the hour was irrelevant because she had already been productive for 2 hours, and therefore the conversation was overdue. "I want to talk about Emily." Something tightened in Daniel's chest. "There's nothing to talk about. I've made my decision." "You've made a decision," Victoria said. "Whether it was the right one is a separate question." This surprised him. His mother had never been Emily's advocate, not once in 10 years. He had counted on that in some unexamined way when he was telling himself that what he was doing was acceptable. "I thought you agreed that Emily and I had grown apart," he said carefully. "I thought many things," Victoria said. "I am revising some of them." "Based on what?" "Based on the fact that Gerald Fitch called me yesterday afternoon," Victoria said. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Daniel had experienced in recent memory. "Gerald Fitch called you," Daniel repeated. "We have known each other for 20 years, Victoria said, "since before your father died. You did not know that because you never asked about the relationships that existed before you arrived on the scene." A pause. Gerald was very concerned. He was also very informative. Daniel pressed his hand flat against the table. "What did he say?" "He said," Victoria replied, her voice taking on the particular precision she used when she wanted every word to land exactly where she aimed it, "that he had been working with Emily since 2016, that she personally rebuilt the bank's confidence in your company during the funding crisis, that he has spoken with her directly no fewer than 12 times in the past 3 years about issues he was not comfortable raising with you. Issues he wasn't—" Daniel stopped, started again. "Why wouldn't he raise them with me? It's my company." "That," Victoria said, is exactly the question Gerald suggested you ask yourself. The silence stretched. Mother. I am not calling to take sides, Victoria said. I am calling because I have watched you for 44 years, and I know the difference between confidence and blindness. And Sunday night I saw the second thing. I dressed it up in my mind as something else because it was easier. I am not going to do that anymore. Daniel had not heard his mother speak that way in a very long time, possibly ever. What are you saying? He asked. I am saying, Victoria said, that you should find a way to speak to Emily that does not involve a lawyer's office before the situation becomes one that can only be resolved through lawyers. A beat. And I am saying that when she agrees to speak to you because Emily is not a vindictive person, she will agree. Eventually, you should go in prepared to hear things that will be difficult. I already know. You know numbers, Victoria said. You do not know what it cost her. Those are different things. She hung up. Daniel sat with the phone in his hand. His mother had never once in 10 years suggested that Emily deserved more than she was getting. He had built partially on that silence a whole internal justification for his choices. And now the silence had spoken, and what it said was not what he had assumed it meant. At 8:30, Howard Park was waiting outside his office when he arrived. The Riverside Partners called, Howard said before Daniel had sat down. They've heard something. I don't know how, but they've heard there's an issue with the credit facility, and they want a call this afternoon. Set it up, Daniel said. Daniel. Howard stepped into the office and closed the door. I need you to understand what we're facing. The Riverside expansion is 40% of our projected revenue for the next 3 years. If that deal destabilizes, we don't have a backup. We have been building toward this project for 18 months. Everything is structured around it. I understand that. Do you? Howard said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite insubordination and was not quite kindness, but was some uncomfortable combination of both. Because the way this gets resolved is Emily. Not lawyers, not negotiations. Emily sitting across from Gerald Fitch and telling him everything is stable. That is the only path that moves quickly enough to save the Riverside timeline. Daniel sat down heavily. She's not returning my calls. Then figure out another way to reach her, Howard said, because we have approximately 72 hours before the Riverside Partners start asking questions we cannot answer, and every hour Emily doesn't pick up is an hour we're moving in the wrong direction. He left the folder on the desk and walked out, and Daniel stared at it, and for the first time in his adult life, he sat in his own office and felt genuinely, specifically helpless. Not the performance of helplessness, not the strategic helplessness of a man who decides he doesn't want to do something and manufactures inability. Real helplessness. The kind that arrives when you finally understand that a situation is entirely outside your control, and the reason it's outside your control is a series of choices you made with complete confidence and are only now understanding were wrong. He picked up his phone. He didn't call Emily, he called Marcus. Marcus picked up on the third ring. Daniel. I need to talk to you, Daniel said. Not about business, about Emily. A long pause. I'm at the office. I'll come to you. Another pause, shorter. Okay, Marcus said. Give me an hour. Marcus worked in a smaller office building in Lincoln Park, running the architecture firm he had started 8 years ago with 2 partners and built into something quiet and respected, the kind of company that got written about in industry publications rather than lifestyle magazines. It suited him. Marcus had always been more interested in building actual things than in being seen building them, which was one of the several ways he and Daniel were fundamentally different people who happened to share a last name. Daniel arrived at Marcus's office at 10:15. Marcus was waiting in the conference room with 2 cups of coffee he had gotten himself, which meant he had not asked his assistant to do it, which meant this was a conversation he wanted to be private. They sat across from each other. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She's already got a lawyer, Daniel said. I know, Marcus said. You know, Renata talked to her yesterday, Marcus said. Emily asked Renata to tell me to wait, to not get involved yet. Daniel absorbed this. She's coordinating what people know. She's managing the situation, Marcus said, which if you think about it is exactly what she's always done. He picked up his coffee. Daniel, I'm going to say some things that are going to be hard to hear. Say them. Marcus set the cup down. "I've watched you for 44 years too," he said, "and I have watched you over the past 4 or 5 years specifically treat Emily like she was a fixture, like she was something that came with the life and would always be there regardless of what you did or didn't do." He paused. "I didn't say anything because it wasn't my marriage, but I watched it." "Marcus." "I'm not done," Marcus said, and his voice was quiet and flat in a way that meant he was serious. "Sunday night when you walked in with Olivia, I wasn't angry at you in the abstract, Daniel. I was angry because I was sitting at that table watching Emily's face when you said, 'She belongs beside me.' And Emily's face did not break. She just went somewhere, inside herself. And I thought, how many times has she done that? How many times has she absorbed something that would have broken another person and just gone inside herself and kept going?" Daniel didn't answer. "She's not fighting you," Marcus said. "That's what you're not understanding. You expected a fight. You planned for a fight. You walked into that dinner prepared to handle a fight." He looked at his brother directly. "She's not fighting. She's just stopped holding things up, and you're only now realizing how much she was holding." The words landed in the room and didn't leave. "How do I fix it?" Daniel said. Marcus looked at him for a long time. "I don't think that's the right question anymore," he said quietly. "What's the right question?" "The right question is what you're actually sorry for," Marcus said. "Not what you need from her, what you owe her, because those are different directions and she's going to know immediately which one you're coming from." Daniel drove back to his office. He did not go in. He sat in the parking garage for 22 minutes. I thought about what Marcus had said. He thought about what Howard had said. He thought about his mother's voice at 6 in the morning saying, "You do not know what it cost her." He thought about Emily at 26 years old, sitting across from investors in a conference room when Daniel was too nervous to go in and had said casually, "You handle it. You're better at them than I am." And she had handled it, and the deal had closed, and he had taken the congratulations afterward and accepted them naturally, and never once looked back at the room where Emily had done the thing he was afraid to do. I thought about the morning in 2017 when he had woken up to find her already gone, her car missing from the driveway, and he had assumed she had an early appointment, and she had come home that evening and said simply, "The bank situation is handled," and he had said, "Good," and gone back to what he was reading. He had said good, one word, for 12 hours of work that had saved his company. He sat in the parking garage and he thought about 10 years of one-word responses to things that deserved paragraphs, and the cold feeling that had started in his spine on Monday morning had now moved into something larger and harder to name. It was not quite guilt, though it contained guilt. It was not quite grief, though it contained that too. It was more like the specific physical sensation of a structure you were standing on, shifting and realizing for the first time that you had not built it yourself, and not knowing whether it would hold. I went back inside. At 2 o'clock, he received an email from Catherine Brennan's office. Formal, structured, courteous. It outlined in legal language both precise and carefully restrained Emily's initial position regarding her financial entanglement with Whitmore Industries. It referenced specific documents by date and instrument number. It was thorough in the way that only something compiled over weeks of preparation can be thorough. And at the bottom above Catherine Brennan's signature was a single paragraph that Daniel read 3 times. It said, "Ms. Carter wishes to make clear that her intention is not to damage the operational integrity of Whitmore Industries, or to harm the employees and stakeholders who depend upon its continued function. She is prepared to engage in a structured and cooperative process of financial restructuring that recognizes both her legal exposure and her historical contributions. She asks only that this process be conducted with the transparency and respect that was absent in the personal circumstances that necessitated it." Transparency and respect. He called his own attorney, a man named David Heller, who handled most of Whitmore Industries' legal work, and read him the email. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Daniel, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer honestly." "Go ahead." "How thoroughly do you understand your own company's financial structure?" The pause before Daniel answered was longer than it should have been. "I understand the big picture," Daniel said. "That's what I thought," David said. "Based on what you've sent me, Emily doesn't just have a legal claim to financial recognition. She has a structural position in the company's credit architecture that gives her significant leverage over the timing and terms of any reorganization. I want to be honest with you. Her attorney has put together a very sophisticated position, and fighting it aggressively is not in your interest. So I cooperate. You cooperate, David said, and you do it quickly because every day this is unresolved is a day the bank and the Riverside partners have a reason to be nervous. Daniel hung up. He opened his desk drawer and took out a personal notepad, the kind he used for things he didn't want to type. He picked up a pen. He sat there for a moment. Then he wrote at the top of the page, "What I actually owe her." He stared at that line for a long time. Then he started writing. I was still writing when Priya knocked on his door at 4:30 and said, "Mr. Whitmore, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment." He looked up. "Who is it?" Priya's expression was carefully neutral in the way it got when she was navigating something delicate. "Olivia Reed," she said. He had not seen Olivia since Sunday night. She had called him Monday morning, and he had taken the call, briefly told her he was dealing with business issues and would call her back. He had not called her back. She had texted twice Monday evening, once asking how he was, once asking if he wanted company, and he had read both messages and not responded. He had not thought about her much. That itself was a piece of information he was not ready to fully examine. "Send her in," he said. Olivia came in, the way she always came in, with the composed, self-possessed energy that had made him feel at the conference in Miami that she was someone who belonged in his world. She was dressed for the office in the way that communicated she had thought about being here, which meant she had dressed for him. She sat across from him. "You haven't called," she said. Not accusatory. Careful. "I've been dealing with a situation," Daniel said. "The company situation." He looked at her. "You've heard people talk," she said. "Daniel, I know this is complicated. I know Emily's involvement is making things difficult, but I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm here. Whatever you're dealing with, we deal with it together." He looked at her for a long moment. Together. I thought about what together had looked like for the past 10 years. Not the Sunday dinners and the charity galas and the photographs in business magazines. The actual together. The 2 a.m. spreadsheets, the Gerald Fitch meetings, the vendor disputes, the quiet, grinding, competent, invisible work of holding something real in place. "Olivia," he said, "how much do you know about credit facility structures?" She blinked. "What?" "Loan guarantees, financial representations to institutional lenders. Do you have experience with that?" "Daniel, I don't see what about vendor contract negotiations or investor relations management? Have you handled any of that?" She sat very straight. "I work in marketing." "I know," he said. The silence between them was a different kind of silence than the one Emily had left in his mother's dining room. Emily's silence had been full, dense, carrying everything in it. This silence was revealing something by being empty. Olivia looked at him steadily. "You're comparing me to her." "No," Daniel said. And then, because he was trying for the first time in recent memory to be precise, "I'm understanding something I should have understood before." "What's that?" He looked at her, and he thought about Sunday night, about the pride he had felt walking her into that dining room, about the expression on his face that had been about performance, about being seen, about the image of himself he was projecting outward. "That I made a choice based on the wrong criteria," he said quietly. Olivia's composure held. She was too good at composure to let it slip entirely, but something shifted behind her eyes. "So what happens now?" she said. "I don't know yet," Daniel said. She nodded slowly. She picked up her purse. She stood. She looked at him with an expression that was complicated in a way he hadn't expected. Not just hurt, but something more honest than hurt, something that looked almost like recognition. "For what it's worth," she said at the door, I think I knew when I walked into that room and saw her face that I had gotten into something I didn't fully understand." Daniel looked at her. What did her face look like? Olivia thought for a moment. "Like someone who had already won an argument she hadn't started yet," she said. She left. Daniel sat in his office and thought about that. At 6:15 that evening, his phone rang. Unknown number. He picked up. "Mr. Whitmore." A woman's voice. Not Robert Cho this time. Someone he didn't recognize. "My name is Susan Mercer. I'm a senior relationship manager at First Midwest Bank. I was Gerald Fitch's supervisor before his retirement 2 months ago." "Gerald retired," Daniel said. "Yes," Susan Mercer said. 2 months ago. He had been planning to for some time. He wanted to see several of his long-term accounts stabilized before he left. A pause. I'm calling because I've taken over his portfolio and I want to be transparent with you about where we stand. Please, Daniel said. The Riverside Credit Facility, Susan said, is our primary concern. As of this morning, we have placed it in a status we call enhanced monitoring, which means we are watching it closely and have not yet made any formal changes to its terms, but we are prepared to do so if the situation warrants. What would trigger a formal change? Daniel asked. Any material alteration in the financial guarantor structure, she said. Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to be direct because I think that serves everyone better than being indirect. Gerald left very detailed notes on this account. Very detailed. Another pause. He wrote in his final account summary that Emily Carter was, and I'm reading directly, the operational and financial backbone of Whitmore Industries, whose personal involvement and institutional relationships represent the primary basis for First Midwest's confidence in the account. Daniel closed his eyes. He also noted, Susan continued, that he had on several occasions attempted to schedule calls with you directly to discuss account management, and that these calls were consistently redirected to Ms. Carter by your office. I didn't know that, Daniel said. I believe you, Susan said, and the simplicity of that response was its own kind of verdict. Mr. Whitmore, we are not unsympathetic to the personal complexity of your situation, but I want to be very clear the path that protects this company's credit standing runs through Emily Carter's cooperation, not around it. I understand, Daniel said. I hope you do, she said, because Gerald cared very much about this company. Not because of the name on the building, because of the person who called him in 2016 when things were going wrong and who told him the truth about the problems and who sat in his office for 3 hours and showed him a real plan. A pause. He cared because of her. She said goodnight and hung up. Daniel sat in the silence of his office for a long time after that. The building was emptying around him. He could hear the muted sounds of other people's evenings beginning elevator doors, distant conversations, the ordinary sounds of people going home to their lives. And he sat in his office in this company he had named for himself, and he held the phone that Emily still wasn't answering, and he thought about Gerald Fitch leaving his final notes on an account that turned out to not be about Daniel Whitmore at all. He thought about 10 years. I thought about what 10 years of being seen and what 10 years of being invisible actually felt like from the inside of each of those experiences, and he thought about which one he had assigned to himself and which one he had assigned to the person who was now quietly and methodically reorganizing the structural foundations of everything he had built. He opened the notepad from his desk. He looked at the list he had made, what I actually owe her. There were 7 items on the list. He read them. He added an 8th, then a 9th. He sat back. He understood something that he had not understood on Sunday night when he had stood in his mother's dining room and smiled at the woman leaving. She had not been losing anything when she walked out that door. She had been free the moment she stood up from that table. The only person losing anything had been him, and he had stood there and smiled about it. He put the notepad in his jacket pocket. He turned off his office light. He walked to the elevator and rode it down to the lobby and walked out into the Chicago evening, and the city moved around him the way it always had, loud and indifferent and alive. He had one thing left that he could do that didn't involve a lawyer or a bank or a financial document. He could tell the truth, not for the company, not for the credit facility, not for the Riverside deal or Gerald Fitch's notes or the $63 million in instruments with Emily's name on them. He could tell the truth because it was the only honest thing left, and because Emily Carter had spent 10 years telling the truth with her actions and her work and her silence, and the least, the very minimum he could offer in return was the same. He took out his phone. He dialed her number. 4 rings. This time, something different. The ringing stopped. A breath. And then Emily's voice quiet and even said, "Daniel," just his name. No warmth in it. No coldness either, just the simple acknowledgement that she knew it was him and had chosen this one time to answer. His chest tightened. He stopped walking. He stood on the sidewalk with people moving around him in every direction. "Emily," he said. "I'm listening," she said. He opened his mouth. And for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, Daniel Whitmore had no prepared speech, no strategy, no performance ready. Just a man on a sidewalk in Chicago, holding a phone facing the scale of what he had done to the most capable, most loyal, most underestimated person he had ever known. He said, "I need to see you." She was quiet for 3 seconds. "Not yet," she said. "Emily." "When I'm ready," she said. "Not before." And she hung up. He stood on the sidewalk. He did not call back, because for the first time he understood that her timeline was not something he could manage or redirect or negotiate around. Her timeline was the only one that mattered now, and respecting it was the smallest possible beginning of something that would take far longer to build than anything he had built before. Somewhere across the city, Emily put her phone face down on the table. She sat for a moment. She had heard it in his voice. Not the Daniel who walked into family dinners with someone else on his arm. Not the Daniel who said, "She belongs beside me," like he was moving furniture. A different voice, smaller, more honest. She had heard it. She had not softened, but she had heard it. She turned her phone back over and looked at the screen for a moment. Then she set it aside and pulled her legal pad back in front of her and picked up her pen, and she kept working. She had a lot left to do, and she had learned over 10 years of doing necessary things without recognition that feelings could exist alongside function. You felt the thing, and then you kept going. 3 days passed after that phone call. 3 days in which Daniel Whitmore did not call Emily again. Not because he didn't want to, because he had understood standing on that sidewalk with her voice still in his ear saying not yet that the version of himself who pushed and maneuvered and managed outcomes was the version that had created this situation in the first place. And that version needed to be quiet now. It was the hardest thing he had done in years. Harder than any deal. Harder than any negotiation. Harder than walking into his mother's dining room on Sunday with Olivia on his arm, which had felt at the time like the boldest thing he had ever done, and which he now understood had been not boldness at all, but a very expensive and very public mistake dressed up as confidence. On Wednesday morning, he met with David Heller and Howard Park together for the first time. The three of them sat in the conference room on the top floor, and Howard laid out the numbers with the kind of clinical precision that made bad news feel even worse because there was nowhere to hide inside it. The Riverside partners had called again. They had heard enough from enough sources that they were now formally requesting a meeting, which in deal language meant they were formally requesting an explanation, which in real language meant they were deciding whether to walk. The West Loop credit line had been placed under the same enhanced monitoring status as the Riverside facility. Susan Mercer had sent a letter that was polite and professional and outlined with great courtesy the specific conditions under which the bank would be forced to act. And that morning, a fourth party had entered the conversation that nobody had anticipated. A woman named Patricia Voss, who ran a mid-size investment group out of Milwaukee and who had been one of Whitmore Industries' earliest backers, had called Howard directly. Not Daniel, Howard. And she had asked in the careful language of someone who has been in business long enough to understand that directness is sometimes the only efficiency, whether Emily Carter was still involved with the company. Howard had said the situation was evolving. Patricia Voss had said, "I see in the tone that communicates that one sees considerably more than one is being told," and had ended the call. "Patricia Voss has been in since the beginning," Howard said, looking at Daniel across the conference table. "She invested because Emily walked her through the business plan in 2014 and answered every question she had for 2 hours in a coffee shop in Milwaukee. I found that out this morning. Patricia told me herself." "Emily never told me that," Daniel said. "Did you ever ask how Patricia Voss came to invest?" Howard said. The question sat in the room without requiring an answer. David Heller cleared his throat. "The legal position is workable," he said. "Catherine Brennan is a professional. Her approach has been cooperative in tone, which I believe reflects Emily's actual intention. But the timeline is compressing. Every day that this is unresolved is a day the business loses ground it cannot easily recover." "So what's the move?" Daniel said. "The move," David said carefully, "is to meet with Emily. On her terms, whatever those terms are." Daniel looked at Howard. "Has she been in contact with anyone at the company?" Howard hesitated. "Howard." "She called Priya on Tuesday," Howard said. "They spoke for about 20 minutes. I don't know what was said. Priya didn't tell me directly, but she seemed settled afterward, less anxious." Daniel absorbed that. Emily had called his assistant. Not him, his assistant. To check on the people in the office, he was almost certain, because that was the kind of thing Emily had always done, attending to the human texture of a place, while the person whose name was on the door attended to his own image. "Set up the meeting," Daniel said, "through David and Catherine, whatever she needs." "I already sent the request this morning," David said. "Catherine's office responded an hour ago." Daniel looked at him. "You sent it before this meeting." "I sent it," David said, meeting his eyes, "because I have been your attorney for 9 years, and I know when a situation has exactly one correct path, and I did not want to waste another morning finding out if you agreed." It was the most direct thing David Heller had ever said to him. Daniel nodded once. "When?" "Friday," David said. 10 a.m. Catherine's office. 2 days. Daniel had 2 days. He spent the first of those days doing something he had never done before in the history of his company. He called Howard into his office and he said, "I want to understand the company's financial structure, all of it, not the summary version, the actual version. Every guarantee, every instrument, every relationship. Start from the beginning." Howard stared at him for a moment. "All of it," Howard said. "All of it," Daniel said. Howard sat down. He opened his laptop, and for the next 6 hours he walked Daniel through the architecture of Whitmore Industries as it actually existed, not as Daniel had understood it to exist, and the gap between those two things was the most educational and most humbling experience Daniel Whitmore had had in his professional life. Emily's name appeared 31 times in the documents Howard walked him through. 31. Not as a spouse listed for formality. As a functioning decision-making relationship holding part of the company's operational and financial structure. Her name was in bank agreements and vendor contracts and investor correspondence and insurance policies and the deed of the corporate headquarters, which she had co-signed in 2016 when the landlord had required a personal guarantee and Daniel had been traveling, and she had handled it without mentioning it when he got back. At 5 in the afternoon, Howard closed his laptop. They sat in silence for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel said. "Over the years. Why didn't you ever sit down with me and show me this?" Howard looked at him carefully. "I assumed you knew," he said. "And after a while I assumed that the arrangement was intentional, that there was a reason it was structured this way." "What reason did you imagine?" Howard was quiet for a moment. "I thought it was trust," he said. "I thought you had structured it this way because she was the person you trusted most. Because putting her name on things was your way of saying she was the foundation." Daniel looked at the closed laptop. "It wasn't intentional," he said. "I know that now," Howard said quietly. They sat with that for a moment. Then Howard said, "Daniel, she saved this company, not once, several times, in ways that never appeared in any press release or board meeting or annual report." He paused. "I want you to know that because I think you need to walk into Friday's meeting understanding the full weight of that." Daniel nodded. He took the notepad from his jacket pocket, the one he had been carrying since Tuesday. He looked at the list. "What I actually owe her." He added 3 more items. That evening, Marcus called. "How are you doing?" Marcus said, not as a formality, as a real question. "I spent 6 hours today learning how my own company works," Daniel said. A pause. And I have spent 15 years telling a story about myself that was missing most of the actual story," Daniel said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard thing to say out loud." "It's harder to know and not say it," Daniel said. "Are you going to be okay for Friday?" "I don't know," Daniel said honestly. "I know what needs to happen for the company. I don't know how to be in a room with her and carry all of this at the same time." "You carry it," Marcus said simply. "That's all. You don't put it down because it's heavy, you just carry it in." A beat. "She's not trying to destroy you," Marcus said. "I want you to hold on to that. Whatever you're walking into on Friday, she's not trying to destroy you. She never was." "I know," Daniel said. "Do you?" Marcus said, and the question was gentle and serious at the same time, because the Daniel who walked into Mom's house on Sunday thought this was a game he was winning. I need to know that Daniel is not showing up on Friday. "He's not," Daniel said. Marcus exhaled slowly. "Okay," he said. "Okay, call me after." They hung up. Daniel sat in the house that had Emily's name on the deed in the quiet that had settled into every room since she left, and he thought about who was going to show up on Friday. He thought about the Daniel who had stood at the head of his mother's table with complete confidence in his own correctness. He thought about the Daniel who had spent 6 hours on Wednesday looking at documents that rewrote the story he had been telling himself for 15 years. I thought about the 6-hour gap between those two men and what it would take to bridge it into something honest. He did not sleep well. He didn't expect to. Friday arrived with the particular quality of mornings that matter sharper than usual, the ordinary sounds of the world carrying an edge that made everything feel slightly too real. Daniel dressed carefully, not in the way he dressed for performances, not the CEO uniform, not the power suit, selected for the impression it made walking into a room. He dressed in the way you dress when you want to be taken seriously as a person rather than a position. Dark jacket, open collar, no tie. He looked in the mirror, and he thought about what Emily would see when he walked in, and for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about how to manage that perception. He was thinking about whether the person in the mirror deserved the meeting he was about to walk into. He decided the honest answer was no, and that he was going anyway because not going was worse. Catherine Brennan's offices were on the 14th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue, the kind of firm that communicated competence through understatement. No flashy lobby, no dramatic artwork, just clean lines and the specific purposeful quiet of serious people doing serious work. David Heller was already in the lobby when Daniel arrived at 9:50. "She's already here," David said. "Has been since 9:30. Of course she had. They rode the elevator up together. David went through the logistics briefly, quietly, the meeting structure, the agenda. Catherine had circulated the order in which items would be addressed. Daniel listened. He heard most of it. The rest of his attention was on the door at the end of the hallway that the receptionist was now leading them toward. He had not seen Emily since Sunday. 5 days. The longest 5 days he suspected he would ever spend. The receptionist opened the conference room door. Emily was sitting at the far end of the table, not the side, the far end, the head of the table where she had placed herself with the quiet deliberateness of someone who understood exactly what that position communicated and had chosen it with full awareness. Catherine Brennan sat to her right, a legal pad in front of her, expression professionally neutral. Robert Cho, who Daniel recognized from his name, though they had never met, sat to Emily's left. Emily looked at Daniel when he walked in. He had tried to prepare himself for this moment. He had thought about it on the drive over in the elevator in the hallway. He had tried to anticipate what it would feel like to be in a room with her again after everything the last 5 days had contained. He had not been able to prepare for the actual experience of it. She looked different. Not visually, she looked exactly as she always had composed, still dressed simply and without performance. But something had changed in the quality of her presence, something that had always been there but had existed quietly underneath like a frequency you could almost hear but couldn't quite locate. It was fully audible now. She was not trying to hide it or minimize it or make it easier for anyone in the room to overlook. She was simply present in the complete sense of that word, in a way she had perhaps never been in his company before, because she had spent 10 years making herself take up less space than she actually occupied. "Emily," Daniel said. "Daniel," she said. The same word she had said on the phone Tuesday night. Still no warmth, still no coldness. Something more precise than either. Clarity. They sat down. David and Catherine exchanged the brief professional courtesies of attorneys who have spoken enough times by phone to dispense with introductions. Papers were placed on the table. The meeting was called to order in the formal sense of Catherine laying out the agenda and confirming that all parties understood the purpose of the conversation. The first 40 minutes were legal and financial. Catherine walked through Emily's position methodically. The documents, the instruments, the historical record of Emily's involvement. Daniel sat and listened and did not interrupt, which took more discipline than he had expected, because several things were said that activated the old reflex to manage to reframe to control the narrative. He sat on those reflexes. He let the record speak. At 10:45, Catherine summarized the proposed restructuring framework. Emily's personal guarantees would be formally extinguished through a negotiated process that involved the bank, the company, and a third-party auditor assessing the fair market value of her historical contributions. A consulting agreement would be established under Emily Carter, consulting, not Whitmore, not a subsidiary, a fully independent entity through which she would provide the company transitional support for a period she would define on her own terms. Her name would be formally recognized in the company's official history, its press materials, and its investor communications. and the house, which had always been hers by deed, would be transferred to sole ownership without contest. David had reviewed all of it in advance. He had told Daniel his assessment on Thursday evening reasonable, fair, and in several respects more generous to Whitmore Industries than it needed to be given Emily's actual legal leverage. When Catherine finished, the room was quiet. Daniel looked across the table at Emily. "The framework is acceptable," he said. "All of it." Catherine made a note. David made a note. Robert Cho made a note. Emily did not make a note. She looked at Daniel steadily. "That's not what I need to hear from you," she said. The room shifted. Catherine glanced at Emily with an expression that suggested she had been expecting this and had decided it was Emily's to handle as she chose. Daniel put down his pen. "What do you need to hear?" he said. Emily was quiet for 3 seconds. When she spoke, her voice was even and controlled, but carried something underneath it that was real in a way the legal language of the past 40 minutes had not been. "I need to know that you understand what actually happened," she said. "Not the version where you made a mistake and now you're correcting it. The real version." "Emily," David started. "It's all right," Daniel said. David went quiet. Daniel looked at Emily across the table, the length of a conference room, which was both a physical distance and something larger, and he took a breath. "I built something," he said, "and I convinced myself I built it alone. Not because the evidence supported that, but because it was easier. Because every time you handled something, it disappeared so cleanly that I could tell myself it was simple, that it didn't require what it actually required." He paused. "And I told myself that you were happy in that arrangement, because you never complained, because you made it look so seamless that I decided the seamlessness meant it wasn't costly." Emily held his gaze. "And you weren't happy," he said. "Not a question." "I was disappearing," she said quietly. "Slowly enough that neither of us noticed, or maybe just slowly enough that you didn't want to notice." That landed. He didn't deflect it. "I didn't want to notice," he said. "You're right. It was convenient not to notice." The room was very still. "And Olivia," Emily said. He nodded. "Was a performance," he said. "I wanted to feel like everything I had came from me, like I had chosen my life rather than grown into it alongside someone who was doing most of the actual growing." He stopped. "Bringing her there was cruel. I knew it was cruel before I did it. I did it anyway because I told myself the cruelty was decisiveness." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "I know you're not a bad person, Daniel," she said finally. "I know that's not a compliment," he said. "It's not an insult either," she said. "It's just the truth. You're not bad. You're someone who was allowed to be careless for too long by too many people, including me. I made it too easy to take me for granted. That's not an excuse for what you did, but it's honest." This was the part Daniel had not been prepared for. Not her anger, he could have handled anger. Not her coldness, he could have managed coldness. This her clear, honest, unflinching seeing of him. All of him, including the parts that were small, and the parts that were better, and the refusal to reduce him to either extreme. It was exactly what she had always done, he realized, seen the complete picture, even now, even here. "What do you want, Emily?" he said. Not the legal version, not the framework version, the real question. "Not for the company, for yourself. What do you want?" She considered it. "I want my name on what I built," she said. "Officially. Not as a footnote, not in a press release no one reads, in the record. I want there to be a record that is true." "Done," he said. "And I want the consulting agreement structured so that I work on my terms, my timeline, and my billing rate, which Catherine has already determined based on market standards for someone with my experience." A pause. "Which is considerably more than I was ever compensated before." "Done," he said again. She looked at him. "You're agreeing very quickly." "Because I spent 4 days understanding what I should have understood 10 years ago," he said. "And because arguing with any of it would require me to believe my version of events over yours, and I don't anymore." Something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, recalibrated, like a measurement being corrected. "The company," she said. "The employees." "I know," he said. "I'm not going to let it fall apart, whatever I have to do." "You'll need to actually learn how it works," she said. "Not the story you tell investors, the actual mechanics. Howard spent 6 hours walking me through it on Wednesday." She raised an eyebrow, just slightly. "All of it. All 31 instances of your name," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "There are 34, she said. Howard missed 3 in the insurance policy annexes. Of course there were 34. Of course she knew the exact number. Then I have more reading to do, he said. Catherine cleared her throat gently. Should we move to the formal agreement? She said. Emily looked at Daniel for one more moment. Then she nodded. The documents came out. The attorneys went through them section by section with the methodical efficiency of people who had done this enough times to move quickly without missing anything. Daniel read every page, which took longer than it might have, because he actually read them every word for the first time in recent memory, approaching a document with the seriousness it deserved. At 12:30, both parties signed. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no ceremony to it. Just 2 people and their attorneys in a conference room, signatures on pages, the formal completion of a legal process. And yet, when Daniel set down the pen after the last signature, he felt something shift in his chest that was not relief exactly, and was not resolution exactly, but was something adjacent to both of those things, like a weight that had been pressing was still present but had changed in quality. Less like something crushing, and more like something real. Catherine and Robert gathered documents. David checked his copies. The room had the organized, exhaling quality of a meeting that has accomplished what it came to accomplish. Emily stood. Daniel stood. The attorneys fell into their own professional conversation about logistics and filing timelines. For a moment, Daniel and Emily stood on the same side of the table, not the opposite ends anymore. Just 2 people in a room, and the formality had concluded, but neither of them had moved toward the door yet. Emily, he said quietly. She looked at him. I'm sorry, he said. Not the apology he had rehearsed in the car. The real one. The one that didn't have a because at the end of it, or a framing designed to soften the accountability. Just the words plainly. She held his gaze. I know, she said. Is that enough? He asked. She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated because she could have said yes and moved on, or said no and wounded him. And instead she thought about it, which was the Emily thing to do. The thorough, precise, take the question seriously thing. It's a beginning, she said finally. Whether it becomes enough depends on what comes after it. He nodded. The Riverside meeting is next Wednesday, he said. Gerald's replacement, Susan Mercer. She'll need someone who knows the account history to vouch for the stability. Catherine will send the bank a formal letter confirming my cooperative involvement, Emily said. That should be sufficient for now. Will you be at the meeting? She looked at him steadily. No, she said. Not yet. You need to learn how to run your own meetings, Daniel. It was not unkind. It was honest, and there was the faintest trace of something in it, not warmth exactly, but not the opposite either, something that suggested the door had not been closed entirely, that the thing between them was complicated and broken and real, and not yet finished being what it was going to be. He nodded. Okay. She picked up her bag. She exchanged a brief word with Catherine. She shook David's hand with the kind of professional courtesy that communicated respect without warmth. At the door she paused. She turned back and looked at Daniel one more time. Howard is a good financial director, she said. He knows more than he's been asked to know. Start asking. And then she walked out. The door closed. David looked at Daniel. That went better than I expected, he said. She was more reasonable than I deserved, Daniel said. Yes. David agreed simply because he was a good enough attorney to know when agreement was the right response. They gathered their things. They rode the elevator down. They walked out into the Michigan Avenue afternoon, the city moving around them, with its usual indifference to the private significance of things. David said he'd follow up on the filing logistics and headed to his car. Daniel stood on the sidewalk. I thought about Emily in that conference room, the head of the table, the 34 instances of her name, the way she had said, it's a beginning with the same careful precision she applied to everything, not making a promise she hadn't evaluated, not closing a door she wasn't sure she wanted closed. He thought about the consulting agreement, Emily Carter Consulting, not Whitmore, her name, finally. He thought about what Marcus had said, you carry it in, that's all. He had carried it in. And the world had not ended, and Emily had not destroyed him, though she could have, though she had every piece in place to do exactly that, and had chosen a different path. Not for him. for the employees, for the stakeholders, for the 47 families that depended on a company staying functional, and perhaps underneath all of that, for the part of herself that believed in building things rather than tearing them down. He took out his phone. He called Patricia Voss. She picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Patricia," he said, "I owe you a conversation, and I owe you some honest information about how this company actually works and who actually built it. Can I take you to lunch next week?" A pause. Longer than a thinking pause. The kind where someone is deciding what version of a person they're dealing with. "I'll have my assistant call yours," she said finally. "Thank you," Daniel said. He hung up. He looked at the phone. He thought about all the calls that had gone one way for years to Emily around him, through her, over her, all the relationships he had assumed were his, because they were attached to his company, without ever examining who had actually built and maintained them. He thought about Gerald Fitch's Christmas cards. He thought about what it meant to build something real versus building a story about building something. He started walking. He had a company to learn how to run, for the first time, for real. And somewhere across the city, Emily Carter was walking back into the future she had been quietly building since the moment she set her wineglass down on a Sunday night and decided that silence was not surrender. It was the beginning of everything she had been waiting to become. The consulting agreement was signed on a Friday. By Monday morning, Emily Carter had already sent her first invoice. Not to Whitmore Industries. Not yet. Her first invoice went to Patricia Voss's investment group in Milwaukee, because Patricia had called her directly on Saturday afternoon, not Daniel's assistant, not through an attorney directly, and had said, "I've been waiting for an excuse to work with you specifically for 8 years. I'd like to stop waiting." Emily had quoted her rate. The rate Catherine had determined based on market standards for someone with her experience and track record. The number that, when Howard Park had first seen it in the consulting agreement, had caused him to go very still for a moment before nodding slowly and writing it down. Patricia Voss had not blinked. "Send me the engagement letter," Patricia had said. "I'll have it back to you by end of day." It had come back in 4 hours. Emily sat at the desk in the apartment she had moved into 2 weeks after the Sunday dinner, a clean, high-floor apartment with good light and enough space for a proper home office, and nobody else's name on the lease but hers, and she looked at the signed engagement letter from Patricia Voss, and she felt something she wanted to identify correctly because she had spent enough years misidentifying her own feelings. It was not triumph. Triumph was about the other person. This was about herself. It was something quieter and more permanent than triumph. It was the specific satisfaction of a woman who had spent a decade being underestimated, finally operating at full capacity in a world that was for the first time seeing her clearly. She filed the letter. She opened her laptop. She started on the work. This was what people on the outside would never fully understand about Emily Carter. She was not energized by conflict. She was not running on anger or the fuel of proving something to someone. She was energized by the work itself. She always had been. The contracts, the financial structures, the relationships with careful, serious people like Patricia Voss and Gerald Fitch, who valued precision and follow-through. This was the thing she had loved since before she understood what to call it. And for 10 years, she had poured that love into a structure that carried someone else's name, and now she was pouring it into her own. The difference was not subtle. The difference was everything. By the end of her first week as Emily Carter Consulting, she had 2 clients, Patricia Voss's group and a real estate development firm in Indianapolis, whose managing partner had been referred to her by Gerald Fitch, who had apparently in his retirement taken up the hobby of telling everyone he had ever respected in business that they should call Emily Carter. She called Gerald on Thursday evening. "I've had 2 referrals from you this week," she said when he picked up. "2 so far," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "I have a list." "Gerald," she said, and her voice carried something warm and real. "You should be resting. You just retired." "I am resting," he said. "I'm making phone calls from my garden. That's rest." She laughed, genuinely. The kind of laugh that surprised her a little with how good it felt, how easy, how long it had been since laughing had felt this uncomplicated. "How are you really?" Gerald asked. Not the professional question, the human one. "I'm good," she said. And then, because it was Gerald and he had earned honesty, "I'm better than I've been in years, maybe ever." "Good," he said simply. "That's what I wanted to hear." "Gerald," she paused, Why didn't you ever tell me how important you considered my role? You could have said something. To Daniel, to the board, anyone." A beat of silence. Thoughtful silence. Gerald Fitch's silences were always thoughtful. "Because it wasn't my place," he said finally. "The value of what you did was always visible to anyone who looked. I looked. I cannot be responsible for the people who chose not to." Another pause. "But Emily, I want you to know something." "What?" "Every time you called me," he said quietly, "every time you walked into my office with a problem and a plan, I went home that evening and told my wife about the meeting. Not about Whitmore Industries, about you. I told her there was a woman running a company that didn't have her name on the door, and that one day when she finally had her name on the door, it was going to be something worth watching." Emily sat very still. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, which she allowed because some things deserve to be received fully. "Call me when you get the next referral," Gerald said. "There are more coming." He hung up. Emily sat at her desk for a moment with the phone in her hand, and she thought about 10 years of Christmas cards and 2-hour meetings, and a bank officer who went home and told his wife about a woman whose name wasn't on the door. And she thought about how value does not disappear because it goes unrecognized. It accumulates. It waits. It is there fully formed the moment conditions allow it to be seen. She put the phone down and went back to work. 3 weeks after the consulting agreement was signed, Daniel Whitmore walked into the Riverside meeting alone. No Emily, no intermediary, no one to redirect or manage or handle it on his behalf. Just Daniel and Howard and David Heller and the Riverside partners across a conference table, and the full weight of understanding his own company's position without anyone else to carry it. He had prepared for 2 weeks. He had read every document in the Riverside file. He had met with Howard 3 times and asked questions. Howard had never been asked before specific questions about specific numbers, and Howard had answered them with the visible relief of a man who had been waiting years for this conversation. He had met with Susan Mercer at First Midwest and sat across from her with Emily's formal letter of cooperative involvement, which Catherine had sent to the bank the Monday after the Friday meeting, and he had answered her questions directly without deflection about the restructuring of Emily's formal role. Susan Mercer had looked at him at the end of that meeting with an expression that was still professionally guarded but contained something he hadn't seen from her before. Cautious respect, not for the name, for the preparation. He had walked out of First Midwest and stood on the sidewalk and called Howard and said, "I think it went okay." And Howard had said, "I know. Susan called me 10 minutes before you did." The Riverside meeting lasted 3 hours. There were hard questions. The partners had done their own research, which meant they had heard versions of the situation that were partly accurate and partly speculation, and Daniel had to sit inside that and answer what was true without becoming defensive, and without throwing Emily's involvement as a shield, which had been the temptation to explain everything, by saying Emily is handling this, because Emily had told him the morning after the Friday meeting, in a brief text message that was the first direct communication between them in days, "You need to learn how to stand in those rooms yourself. I'll provide the formal letters. You do the standing." He had done the standing. At the 2-hour mark, when the senior Riverside partner, a man named James Cortland, who had been in real estate development for 30 years and had seen every species of deal go wrong in every possible way, leaned back in his chair and said, "Tell me why I should still believe in this project." Daniel had not reached for a story. He had reached for the truth. He said, "Because the fundamentals of this project have not changed. The location, the market analysis, the construction timeline, none of that has changed. What changed is that I came very close to losing the financial infrastructure of this company because I had not been paying attention to how it was actually built. I have spent the last 3 weeks paying attention, and I am standing here today without the person who was holding things together, proving to myself as much as to you that this company can stand on its own." James Cortland looked at him for a long moment. "That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a deal meeting in about 5 years," he said. The meeting ended with a conditional continuation of the Riverside Partnership contingent on a 60-day stability review. Not a full green light, but not a withdrawal, a chance. Daniel drove back to the office and sat at his desk and called Marcus. "It went okay," he said. "Define okay," Marcus said. 60-day review. They didn't walk." "That's better than okay," Marcus said. "I told them the truth," Daniel said. "Not the version, the actual truth." Marcus was quiet for a moment. How did that feel? Daniel thought about it. Terrifying, he said, and then lighter, like I'd been carrying something heavy and put it down, and the thing I'd been dreading putting down turned out to be manageable without it. That's what honesty feels like, Marcus said. You haven't done it in a while, so I understand the novelty. Marcus. I'm glad it went well, Marcus said, and his voice was genuinely warm. I mean it. Is Renato all right? Daniel asked. The baby. She's good. She's great. She's large and uncomfortable and reading every parenting book ever published and absolutely fine. A pause. Emily called her last week. Daniel went still. What did she say? She asked how the pregnancy was going, Marcus said. She asked about Renata's doctor. She told Renata she was happy for them. He paused. She asked about you. Daniel's hand tightened on the phone. She asked about me. She asked if you were doing all right, Marcus said. Not fishing, not checking on the company. She asked as a person who spent 10 years caring about someone and didn't stop caring because the circumstances changed. The room was very quiet. She's remarkable, Daniel said softly. She always was, Marcus said simply. The question was always whether you were going to see it. After he hung up, Daniel sat at his desk for a long time. He thought about Emily asking Renata if he was doing all right. He thought about what that cost her, the openness of it, the refusal to perform bitterness, the decision to remain a whole person who could still hold concern for someone who had hurt her without letting that concern compromise her dignity. He had been raised to believe that strength was about never showing weakness, never backing down, never letting anyone see the cost of anything. Emily had spent 10 years showing him a different kind of strength, and he had mistaken it for accommodation. He took out the notepad from his jacket pocket. He looked at the list. He put the notepad in his desk drawer. I didn't need the list anymore. He had stopped needing it as a reminder and started knowing it the way you know something you finally actually learned. 6 weeks after the Sunday dinner that changed everything. Emily Carter, consulting, had 4 clients, 2 retainer agreements, and a meeting scheduled with a 5th prospect who had been referred by Patricia Voss, who had apparently told her entire professional network that if they needed someone who understood the real architecture of a business deal rather than just its surface appearance, there was one person to call. Emily had hired an assistant, a young woman named Claire, 24 years old, quick and organized and honest about what she didn't know, which Emily considered a more valuable quality than most people recognized. She had offered Claire a clear job description, a fair salary, and the specific promise that Emily Carter Consulting would always give credit where credit was due. Claire had accepted without hesitation. The morning Emily introduced Claire to the office, the real office, not the home desk, but the leased space on the 7th floor of a building in the West Loop that had Emily's name on the door in simple, clean letters, she stood in the middle of the main room and felt the full reality of where she was. This was hers, not shared, not behind someone else's, not kept in a locked drawer or signed in margins or tucked into the footnotes of another person's story. All of it was hers. Catherine Brennan stopped by that afternoon, not for a meeting, just to see it. She stood in the doorway and looked at the name on the door and then at Emily and said, "That looks right." "It does," Emily said. "How are you sleeping?" Catherine asked. 8 hours, Emily said. "For the first time in years." Catherine smiled. "Good," she said. "That's what I wanted to know." She didn't stay long. She had her own work to get back to her own building full of serious people doing serious work. But she had come and the visit said what it was meant to say, which was that the people who had watched Emily move through this with her particular brand of controlled competence and honest intention were paying attention. Were glad. That evening, Emily sat at her desk after Claire had gone home in the quiet of a building winding down for the night, and she opened her email. There was one from Daniel. She looked at it for a moment before opening it, not with dread, not with the old, complicated mix of obligation and diminishment that had characterized so many years of correspondence with him, with something more neutral, more honest. She opened it. It was not long. Daniel, she had learned over 10 years, was at his best when he was brief. When he wasn't performing, his words became cleaner, more direct, less decorated. The email said the Riverside 60-day review is on track. Howard told me today that the bank is satisfied with the stability indicators. I wanted you to know because it would not be on track without what you did. Not just the letter, everything before that. I also wanted to say that I had lunch with Patricia Voss last week. She spent 40 minutes telling me things about how she came to invest in Whitmore Industries that I had never known. I listened. I didn't try to reframe any of it. I thought you should know that. I hope the office is what you wanted it to be. Emily read it twice. She sat with it for a moment. Then she typed back, "The office is exactly what I wanted it to be. I'm glad the Riverside Review is on track. The employees deserve that. Regarding Patricia, she's been a straight shooter for as long as I've known her. If she spent 40 minutes telling you something, it was worth hearing. Thank you for listening." She paused. She added, "You're learning. That matters." She sent it. She closed her laptop. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the office, her name, her work, and she thought about the word learning. It was not forgiveness. It was not an invitation. It was not the opening of a door she had carefully and deliberately closed. It was simply the truth stated cleanly, because Emily Carter had spent too long softening truths to make other people comfortable and was done with that particular habit. He was learning. That mattered. Not for her, for the 47 employees, for Patricia Voss and Gerald Fitch's referrals, and the vendors and the stakeholders, and the whole living ecosystem of people whose livelihoods were attached to a company that needed to be run by someone who was actually present in it. It mattered in the objective way that things matter when they are real. The following month brought the thing nobody had seen coming. Not Daniel, not Catherine, not even Marcus, who had been paying close attention to everything. The Chicago Business Review ran a profile, not on Whitmore Industries, not on Daniel Whitmore, on Emily Carter Consulting, which at 8 weeks old had already accumulated a client roster that the journalist, a woman named Dana Choi, who covered women in business with the specific sharpness of someone who had been underestimated herself, described as extraordinary for a firm of its age. Dana Choi had reached out to Emily through Patricia Voss, who had apparently recommended the story with the same directness she applied to everything. Emily had agreed to the interview after thinking about it for 2 days, not because she wanted attention, but because she had decided that visibility and credit were things she was no longer going to refuse out of a habit of smallness. She had told the truth in the interview. Not all of it. Not the personal details, not Daniel's name, not the Sunday dinner or the dining room or the glass she set down so carefully. Those things were hers, and she kept them. But the professional truth, the years of work, the financial restructuring, the investor relationships, the late nights and the bank meetings, and the way her name had been on instruments no one thought to mention in the press releases, she told that. Dana Choi had listened with the attention of someone who recognized an important story and was not going to waste it. The profile ran on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Emily's phone had rung 14 times. 3 were from journalists wanting follow-up. 2 were from firms asking about potential engagements. 4 were from women she had known professionally over the years, who called to say some version of, "I read it and I recognized it, and I'm so glad you said it out loud." 1 was from Gerald Fitch, who called from his garden and said simply, "That's the record I told you I wanted to see." 1 was from Victoria Whitmore. Emily almost didn't answer. Then she answered. "Victoria," she said. "Emily," a pause. "I read the piece." "I know," Emily said. "You were kind," Victoria said, "about all of it. Kinder than you were required to be." Emily waited. "I have not been kind to you," Victoria said. "Over the years, I made assessments that were incorrect, and I held them past the point where the evidence required me to revise them. That is a failure of character on my part, and I would like to say so directly." It was, Emily recognized, the hardest kind of sentence for Victoria Whitmore to say, not because she lacked the vocabulary, but because she was a woman who had built her entire identity around never being wrong, and what she had just said was an admission that she had been. "I appreciate that, Victoria," Emily said, and she meant it. "I have also," Victoria continued, "told Daniel that if he is serious about becoming the kind of man who deserves to run a company that a person like you helped build, he has a great deal of work left to do." "You're right," Emily said. "I usually am," Victoria said, and there was, for the first time in 10 years of knowing her, a thread of something genuine and almost self-aware in it. "It is regrettable that this time it took me too long." Emily sat at her desk after Victoria hung up and thought about what it took for a woman like that to make that call. The sheer internal labor of it, the willingness to be seen being wrong. Maybe she thought people were more capable of change than they appeared when you were standing too close to them to see the full picture. Maybe distance was sometimes what made growth possible. She thought about herself at 26, arriving at a family dinner for the first time and standing in the hallway, hearing the words sweet, delivered like a consolation prize. And she thought about herself now at 38, sitting in her own office with her name on the door and a phone that wouldn't stop ringing. And she thought about all the versions of herself that had existed in between. The version that had believed staying small was the same as being good. The version that had confused sacrifice with love. The version that had set a glass down on a Sunday night and walked out of a room and said nothing, because the silence was more powerful than anything she could have said. She did not regret those years entirely. She had learned things in them that could only be learned by living inside them. She had developed a capacity for patience and precision and long-horizon thinking that was now in this office, in this work, paying dividends she had never calculated because she had never imagined being able to deploy it fully. But she was done mourning the years. She was too busy with what came next. The 60-day Riverside Review concluded successfully on a Thursday. Daniel texted her that afternoon. "Just it cleared. Thank you." She texted back, "Congratulations. Now keep going." She meant it completely. The company's stability was not something she monitored with satisfaction or anxiety. It was simply a background fact, like the existence of a building she had helped construct and had now stepped back from to let stand on its own. It would either stand or it would not. She had done her part. The rest was Daniel's to carry. She had her own building now. 2 months after Emily Carter Consulting opened its doors, Gerald Fitch's list had produced 7 referrals, 5 of which had converted to active clients. Patricia Voss had introduced Emily to 2 additional investors who were evaluating potential engagements. And Dana Choi had emailed to say the profile had been the most read piece the Chicago Business Review had run in 6 months, and would Emily be open to a follow-up conversation in 3 months. Emily had written back, "Ask me in 3 months. I'll have more to say by then." She hired a second person. Not an assistant this time. A junior consultant, a woman named Janelle with 7 years of financial analysis experience and the specific combination of technical skill and interpersonal intelligence that Emily recognized as valuable because she had spent years watching what happened when you had one without the other. Janelle came with her own network, her own perspective, her own way of approaching problems that was different from Emily's and therefore useful. Emily gave Janelle her own accounts to run from the beginning. She gave her credit on every piece of work. She introduced her to clients by saying, "This is Janelle, she's handling this project, not this is my assistant." Janelle noticed. Janelle told Emily at the end of her 3rd week, "I've never had a boss who introduced me by what I was doing rather than what I was to them." Emily looked at her. "Get used to it," she said. "That's how this place works." The Saturday morning that marked exactly 3 months since the Sunday dinner, Emily woke up in her apartment and lay in bed for a few minutes, something she had not done in years, simply lying still without immediately reaching for the laptop or the phone or the mental list of things requiring her attention. She lay in the quiet of a morning that belonged entirely to her, and she noticed the quiet, and she let it be. She thought about the dinner table, the glass, the walk to the door. She thought about the silence that everyone had read as defeat. She thought about everything that silence had actually contained. She got up. She made coffee, she finished. She sat at her kitchen table, her kitchen, her apartment, her life, and she opened her laptop and started on the week's work, and the feeling that accompanied the opening of the laptop was not obligation or performance or the exhausting maintenance of someone else's story. It was purpose. Clean and specific and entirely her own. 3 months ago, she had been the woman behind the name, the signature on the instruments, the voice on the phone that resolved the crises. Nobody announced the person who built things in margins and footnotes and late-night spreadsheets, while someone else accepted the congratulations in the morning. Today, she was Emily Carter, founder, principal consultant, the person whose name was on the door and whose name was on the work and whose name people called when they needed someone who would tell them the truth and then build something real on top of it. She had not become this. She had always been this. She had simply finally stopped apologizing for it. And that was the thing nobody who watched from the outside would ever fully understand. The transformation was not from weakness to strength. It was from invisible to visible. The strength had been there the whole time, present and patient, and quietly extraordinary, doing its work in the background of someone else's story. The story had changed, not because Emily had fought her way into it, because she had simply stopped standing in the background of it. She had walked through the door, her own door, and everything waiting on the other side of it had been hers all along.